Greetings everyone. Welcome to the lecture on Historiographical Approach to Indian Art. Presently, we are discussing different schools of thought and how they have kind of interrogated different art forms and also explained different artistic traditions. So in this context, I would like to mention Henry Cole's publication of the Catalogue of Indian Art Collection at the South Kensington Museum in 1874, which represents the starting viewpoint of appreciation of Indian art, and the other end comprises the prolific history of Indian and Indonesian art by Coomaraswamy. A reference to these sources kind of indicates different kind of interpretation of the artistic accomplishments of early India. Between these 2 years, using largely tools of Western methodologies and colonial understanding, these writings came to highlight the approaches to the study of Indian art into 2 important kind of viewpoints. One that has been described as archaeological and the other that has been described as transcendental. Now, if we are talking about the archaeological approach, then European Greco-Roman classical art was described as having no parallel, and all Indian art was to be judged against that, because that was the kind of superiority complex that colonial administrators had, because they thought that nothing could beat the classical Greco-Roman world, and whatever they had achieved was the best. So therefore, if anything had to be judged, it had to be compared only to with that, and not by its own distinctiveness, because India had a different context altogether, and the political, social, economic, cultural traditions prevalent in India definitely could not be equated with those that were prevalent in the European world during the earlier times. But this kind of lopsided approach kind of was rooted in their attempt to develop a universal art history. And for the second group, the classical art was denied its superiority, as the best of Indian art was superior to the classical, and it embodied high notions of spiritual knowledge. Carrying on our discussion regarding the archaeological or the Orientalist canon, India was virtually an unknown terrain for the colonial administrators when they came into contact with Indians, and from 1757 onwards with the process of political subjugation, and then by the end of 18th century and beginning of 19th century, there was now more and more attempt to know more about Indian society. Knowledge of Indian art was fragmentary and at best looked down upon. Religious sculpture, which was a very important part of Indian art, was perceived as representing monstrous creatures and forms that were beyond the comprehension of British scholars. So because they could not comprehend, they kind of ridiculed and they kind of projected these different images and sculptures as being not of a higher level of creation. So with ideas of the 18th century Enlightenment and colonialist expansion, interest was invoked in studies related to the Orient, and thus began the formation of the Orientalist canon to understand South Asian art. Now, the basis of this was to create more and more knowledge, not to kind of explain the things as they were. So the only idea was to know the ruled better so that they could rule in a more sterner manner. Initially, ancient Indian Vedic and Buddhist texts in Sanskrit were studied, and later monuments were surveyed, and art came to be catalogued and collected in museums under the guidance of colonial administrators. Here again, the aim was more to create some kind of a cataloging and account keeping and record keeping, so as to so that this leads to a chronological understanding of Indian past. The underlying discourse was that ancient times were a civilization of greatness, a golden age that declined with the onset of medieval period. So this was also the kind of discourse that started developing. In the course of time, by early 19th century, Europeans' own sense of prominence came to question India's ancient greatness, as well as concepts of the Orientalist canon were shaped further. And its most classic and articulate example was James Mill's History of British India, which was developed in 9 volumes. So with this kind of history writing and also complete establishment of Orientalist understanding, a very specific kind of projection of Indian past was being made. In the archaeological Orientalist canon, classical European art far surpassed any other, and all art forms had to be judged by its universal Western benchmarking. So therefore, even monuments like Taj Mahal, which was considered as a piece of utmost beauty, could not surpass the grandeur of the Greek pantheon. So therefore, Parthenon as a building, as a monument, was far more grand and beautiful as compared to Taj Mahal, according to British scholars. Now this canon presumed that the identity of the so-called barbarous and rude people could only be constructed by means of religion, caste or race. Societies were therefore labelled by Britishers as Hindu or Muslim, and this definitely was because of their idea of divide and rule. So therefore, while explaining India's past, Indian history, art and different artistic accomplishments, here also this divisive policy of applying Hinduism and Islamic philosophy or identity was kind of not done away with. In fact, it was reinforced. So ancient Indian art was labelled Hindu, Buddhist or Jain, while medieval art was labelled as Muslim or Hindu, without taking into account the fact that most of these art forms, even when they were coming up in medieval period, were a result of hard work and efforts of people belonging to all communities. So there was nothing Hindu or Muslim about them, and also primacy of race was emphasized. Indigenous Indians were Dravidians who were ousted by the superior Aryans who came from outside. So this kind of projection of history had certain preconceived agenda, and Indian art also very soon fell prey to this kind of biased agenda. The debate on Dravid versus Aryan became a significant trait of this very approach of Europeans. So what emerged was a biased history. The Vedic and Buddhist periods art and culture, being Aryan, was projected as pure and pristine, while the early medieval Hindu idiom was projected as decadent because of overtly decorated Dravidian temples. So instead of accepting the things as they were and trying to analyze the hidden meanings behind them, they started judging. So Buddhist art was par excellence because it had certain Aryan elements and was influenced by Greco-Bactrian forms. So therefore Gandhara art was highly appreciated by them because here they found certain features that were quite similar to the images or the iconography that was prevalent in the European world, whereas the rest of the art forms were not considered as attractive or great or efficiently made as the Gandhara art. So the Buddha icons from Gandhara school fell in this categorization. Gandhara was projected as great by colonial administrators because it was Greece derived. The most articulate supporter of the foreign origin of Gandhara art theory was Ferguson. So with these kind of biases, a very specific kind of understanding of early Indian art could be made available. Now coming to the issue of Islamic art. Islamic art too was projected more rational and comprehensible because it came from outside and was not bogged down by the rules of the Varna hierarchy. So therefore there were set ideas, set patterns which were kind of implemented, and the most influential protagonists in this group writing on the arts and culture of India were R. Orme during 18th century, then Henry Cole during 1874, George Birdwood who wrote in 1888, 1891, then it was H.T. Colebrook writing in 1807, 1817 and then 1858, and Alexander Cunningham, his archaeological surveys of monuments and their reports that came out in 1871 and 1873 was quite an exhaustive list. And then finally James Ferguson 1876 and V.A. Smith 1911. So their writings definitely contributed a lot to our understanding of whatever was available, and archaeological reporting and also cataloging and creating proper records. But then all this had a certain hidden agenda as well as a loop-sided approach, which definitely kept the issue of understanding Indian art open. Now the next approach that we can talk about as to what was the alternative view of another group of historians is the transcendental understanding of Indian art, which was carried forward by the nationalists. So by the beginning of 20th century, challenges began to come and superiority of European art came to be questioned against the background of modernity and rise of Indian nationalism. So here again we see the importance of context is must be taken into account, because now early 20th century was a time when national movement was spreading, and there were several scholars who having accessed modern education, being exposed to Western ideas, and also being inspired by the idea of freedom struggle, started questioning the kind of projection of early Indian history, and so they started doubting whatever had been handed down to them by the colonial scholars. So to this second group, the nationalist scholars, they started projecting Indian art in a different way. So Indian art had to be appreciated for its own merits and on its own terms. So it was wrong according to them to kind of always keep comparing Indian art with the Greco-Roman accomplishments. The use of European classical standards to judge arts, therefore, was rejected. It was not as if only Indian scholars were attempting this kind of an approach, because there was a scholar, Ernest Havel, who kind of through his writings that came out in 1908 and 1920, and then later on A.K. Kumaraswamy, who wrote extensively from 1913 onwards, that they started spearheading this approach of questioning and rejecting the earlier ideas that had been developed by the colonial scholars. Havel, according to Partha Mitter, argued for an intrinsically perceptual approach instead of a conceptual one, so favored by the archaeologists. So we see that the conceptual approach of archaeologists was being rejected, and what according to Havel was more important and need of the hour was to understand the perceptual ideas, the perception. So perception was more important, and it was also kind of away from reality. It was more imaginary. It also had association with the abstract ideas. So the failure of the Western mind to appreciate India's religious, mythological and philosophical mind had led the archaeologists, in spite of their contribution in accumulating impressive information, to not truly appreciate Indian art, which was a living thing. So this beautifully describes that Indian art could no longer be studied in the form of a concept, because it was a living thing. It was not a thing even. It was a feeling, and that feeling could only be understood if one kind of explored the perception behind it. And within this paradigm, Havel re-evaluated the image of Buddha from Gandhara, and while referring to archaeologists' viewpoint on Gandhara, he found that the Buddha images at Gandhara were not the real representations of the Buddhist divine ideals, and that they were overvalued by the archaeologists simply because they had some features of commonality with the Greco-Roman kind of art. So therefore, art appreciation was made by Havel as more rooted to the context and political, social and cultural developments that were pertaining. So Havel kind of declared that the images of Gandhara appeared more plastic, they appeared soulless, and they had no spiritual grace that was there in the later Buddha icons. It was not as if only Western, any kind of similarity with the Western world could make or break art. So therefore, a different kind of beauty was being recognized by these scholars, and spirituality, the idea of spirituality and grace was according to them far more important because it was rooted in Indian culture. And this was because they were the work of inferior craftsmen. So Havel, during the course of his research, kind of found out that the images of Gandhara, the images of Buddha from Gandhara, many of these images were being made not by very proficient craftsmen, but rather by inferior craftsmen who came from the dying art of Greece, and they had been hired by Gandhara rulers, and they worked under the orders of Buddhist monks. So for Havel, the best of Gandhara did not have the spirituality of the true Indian ideal that was seen later in the Buddha images at Elephanta and Ellora. which had no impact of the Greco-Roman style of art. So Havel thought the Gandhara school was not an example of Hellenistic influence upon Indian art, but it was the reverse. It showed Greco-Roman art being gradually Indianized. Now this again was a new point that was being made, and this again kind of recognized the greatness of Indian culture, its ability to absorb and its ability to influence. So according to Havel, Indian art is essentially idealistic, mystic, symbolic and transcendental. So according to Havel, the Indian art is both a priest and a poet. Now these are the qualities that can come only with lot of patience, lot of respect towards the work that one is doing, and also with lot of contemplation. So therefore, making any kind of object of art, according to Havel, was not a plastic effort, it was not a mechanical effort, rather it involved a process, rather it involved a feeling, and this mysticism and this transcendental nature is therefore reflected in most of the iconography, in most of the paintings that one can talk of. Now another important aspect that one can talk about is Neoplatonism. Theoretically, the concept of spirituality in arts is derived from the Neoplatonian notions of idea and spirit, that art embodies an idea, an inner world of beauty that has an intrinsic meaning. Now this is a theory that had developed in the West from Plato to Hegel, and so Neoplatonism began to take note of the fact that idea was as important as the spirit. Havel was convinced that spirituality played a part in evolution of arts and not imitation of nature as envisaged in the archaeological standpoints that had been spearheaded by the Orientalist scholars. So this approach to evaluate Indian art was further developed by A.K. Coomaraswamy, who was equally concerned with the spiritual quality of Indian art. To him also, Indian art was spirituality imbued with Platonian notions of idea and spirit, and that all art was religion. All art, according to Coomaraswamy, had some kind of attachment with religion. So idea and spirit could not be left behind. He saw unity in art, life and religion also. For Coomaraswamy, nature is transcendent and exists on a metaphysical plane in every artist's mind, and it is this inner vision of the artist which, when externalized and it gets a material representation, that an artistic creation is born. The special technique of vision brought forth by the practice of yoga known to the traditional artist was discussed at length by Coomaraswamy. Yoga, according to Coomaraswamy, was the specialized technique that aided the inner vision of the artist to materialize into a specific art form. So here also he repeatedly discussed the importance of transcendental nature of Indian art and the importance of inner vision of the artist. Within this, he even looked at the form of doom as a work of imagination and spirituality rather than only of technique. So this union of art and religion was central to Coomaraswamy's theory of art, and in fact there are several ancient texts that describe all art activities as spiritual. However, one cannot really take into account this school of thought also in its totality. So therefore, there is a critique of metaphysical generalizations also, because there is also a need to understand the individualistic humanistic approach, and in order to understand the true meaning of art. To reconstruct the precise relationship between art and religion itself, one needs to look at humanistic and socio-political contexts. To know art, one has to look at its sociological moorings, the individual specificities, particular time and space, as all art is embedded in its individual social and political context. So therefore, there is a need to understand art by its nature as a visual commentary on or a concrete manifestation of thought which is abstract and invisible also. So everything which is visible to us may not be the ultimate truth. So there is a need to go beyond, to look beyond, and to try to understand the abstract and invisible ideas. Thank you.